Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. It was one of those miserable nights when the sky seemed to be holding its breath, like it was waiting for something terrible to happen. I remember the air being thick with moisture, the kind of humidity that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. It wasn't a storm that started suddenly. It had been drizzling for hours, but then, as I was walking home, it felt like the clouds finally gave up and released everything they'd been holding. The rain came down in sheets, thick and cold, so heavy it felt like I was walking through a curtain of water. The streets started to flood, the gutters filling up with the rushing, muddy runoff. Everything was drowned in the sound of it. Thunder rumbling in the distance, raindrops hammering down on everything. Even the familiar streetlights seemed to be dimmed by the downpour, casting weak yellow pools of light onto the soaked asphalt. I was used to the weather in California, the quick shifts from clear skies to sudden downpours. But this storm was different. The wind was howling, sending trash cans tumbling down the sidewalk and whipping branches off trees. It was one of those rare storms that felt dangerous, unpredictable. I could barely hear anything over the roar of the rain, and the wind was so strong that it felt like the sky itself was trying to swallow me up. I had been at work all day and was exhausted, my mind racing with thoughts of home, of getting out of these soaked clothes and just lying down somewhere dry. I had no car. I lived just a short walk from the office, about 20 minutes if I kept a decent pace. Normally it wouldn't be a big deal, but tonight I was struggling to keep my thoughts focused, too distracted by the storm. I remember wishing, halfway through my walk, that I had thought to bring an umbrella, but it was too late for that. The streets were eerily quiet, no cars on the road, no other pedestrians, just me and the storm, the wind biting at my skin, the world muffled beneath the constant roar of rain. I walked past rows of houses, the dark windows like vacant eyes staring out at me. Everything felt wrong, like I was walking in someone else's dream, disconnected from reality. The closer I got to home, the more oppressive the air felt. The pressure of the storm hanging over me made it hard to shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the sidewalk, barely visible through the downpour, a small, pale figure in a sea of dark gray. At first, I thought she was a mirage. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, or maybe I'd been out in the rain too long, but as I drew closer, I realized it was real. A little girl. She was standing completely still, her back slightly hunched as if she were trying to shield herself from the rain. Her hair clung to her face, soaking wet, and her clothes, a thin yellow dress, looked soaked through. The dress was too flimsy for a night like this, for this kind of cold. She wasn't wearing shoes, her feet bare and covered in mud. I don't know why I noticed these details so quickly, but I did. She wasn't even trying to take shelter under a tree or a porch, and she was crying. I don't know if it was the storm or just the isolation of that street, but hearing her sobs made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The sound seemed amplified in the silence of the night, carried on the wind like it was something alive. My first instinct was to call out, to make sure she wasn't alone, that she wasn't in trouble. I mean, what kind of parent lets their child wander the streets in this kind of weather, especially a storm like this? I knew this area, and I knew that most of the neighbors were older or just people who didn't have kids. It didn't make sense. "Hey," I called, my voice louder than I meant it to be. The wind and rain almost drowned out my words. "Are you okay?" The little girl didn't respond. She didn't even move. Her head was bowed, her tiny body trembling, but she didn't look up at me, didn't acknowledge that I was there at all. I took a couple more steps toward her, like the wet pavement making every movement feel like it was in slow motion. There was something unsettling about the way she just stood there, like she was in a trance. I took another few steps and stopped a few feet away from her. She was closer now, but still not moving, her sobs barely audible now. Something about her face was hard to make out in the rain, but I could see enough to know that she looked off. There was a kind of emptiness in her features, her eyes obscured by wet hair, but it was almost like she was staring through me. "Hey," I repeated, now more quietly. "Are you lost?" At that, she suddenly stopped crying. The abrupt silence felt like a punch in the gut. I froze in place, the stillness making my heart beat faster. I was standing right in front of her now, but she didn't look at me, not for a long while. I watched the rain pour off her shoulders, pooling on the ground at her feet. I waited, and then, slowly, she raised her head. When her eyes finally met mine, I felt a chill run through me. They were wide and too dark. The pupils were like black voids, and they didn't blink. It was like looking into something that didn't belong to a child, something cold and distant. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, that maybe the storm was messing with my mind, but then her mouth twisted into a strange, almost empty smile, and I knew this was no ordinary encounter. She didn't answer my question, but she looked at me, really looked at me, and then whispered, "I'm waiting for my mom." It should have been comforting to hear, right? A little girl waiting for her mom. But instead, it felt wrong. That smile was too empty. The words too rehearsed. I didn't know why, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right here. Something was off in the way she spoke, the way she stood, as if she were completely unaware of the storm around her. "Where's your mom?" I asked, despite the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. She didn't answer right away, but when she finally did, her voice was almost too soft to hear. "She's coming." That's when I started to feel that pressure in my chest. My heart thudded harder. My instincts kicked in, and I took a small step back. I looked around. Nobody else was there. Not a car, not a person, just me and this strange girl in the storm. My eyes darted from side to side, my senses tingling with unease. Where were her parents? Why was she out here alone? Why wasn't she panicking or looking for help? Before I could process it any further, I heard the sound, the unmistakable footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, heavy, not the kind of footsteps you expect from someone out for a walk. The sound came from behind me, from the direction I had just walked, and for a moment I froze, listening. The footsteps came closer, the sound of wet shoes on the pavement growing louder. I turned my head, just enough to see a shadow shifting in the streetlight behind me. There was someone there, someone I hadn't noticed before. The air around me felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. In that split second, I looked back at the girl. She was gone. She wasn't standing there anymore. A knot tightened in my stomach, panic rising in my chest. I whipped my head back to the shadow in the street. The person was getting closer. My heart began to race. I turned back to where the girl had been, hoping that maybe she had just moved, that maybe I had been imagining it. But I knew it wasn't right. The footsteps behind me grew louder, and without thinking, I took off running. But before I could take more than 2 steps, I was grabbed. A strong hand wrapped around my mouth, pulling me backward with such force that I couldn't even react. I tried to scream, but the hand on my face was suffocating, pressing down until I couldn't breathe. I struggled, thrashing wildly, but whoever had me was stronger than I ever expected. I slammed into something solid, a fence, a post, and the air was knocked out of my lungs. My vision blurred as I gasped for breath, my body fighting against the iron grip that held me. I heard the voice again, the same one as before, but now it wasn't coming from the girl. It came from behind me. "She's just bait," the voice hissed in my ear. "Just bait for people like you." The realization hit me with full force. The girl wasn't lost, she had been used. a trap, and I had walked right into it. I was too slow, too distracted, and before I could do anything else, the world went black. I don't know how long I was out. The world felt like it was spinning when I woke up, my head pounding, the air still thick with the storm's humidity. My body was stiff, and I felt disoriented, unsure of where I was at first. The sound of the rain was still there, but now it was muffled. My chest ached as I tried to breathe, as if I'd been knocked out or had been holding my breath for too long. I tried to move, but my arms were bound tightly behind my back, the ropes cutting into my skin. I froze. Ropes! I tried to call out, but my mouth was dry and I couldn't make a sound. Panic began to creep in again, and I realized I was in a different place now. I wasn't on the street anymore. I was in a garage, a dark, concrete room. The only light came from a small window near the ceiling, where the rainwater pooled on the sill and dripped down in steady drops. The walls were bare, the place was cold, and there was no furniture, nothing but the floor beneath me and the sound of the storm outside. The smell hit me next, a mixture of oil, damp wood, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I was alone. I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to think. How did I get here? I had been walking, then that little girl, the footsteps behind me, and that voice, the grip on my mouth. The trap. That's when it all hit me. They hadn't just grabbed me randomly. They had been waiting for the perfect moment. It wasn't just a random kidnapping. It wasn't an accident. I was targeted. I struggled against the ropes, but they were tied tightly. Whoever had done this was experienced. I didn't know if there was anyone else in the garage with me. I didn't know if they were watching me, waiting for me to make a move. But I couldn't stay here. I had to figure out how to get out. My heart raced again, pounding in my ears. Think! Think! I closed my eyes, trying to recall every detail. The girl, her face, the way she just stood there, unblinking, as if she were waiting for something. It didn't make sense. Why a little girl? Why go to all that effort just to lure people into a trap? Was this a part of something bigger? A gang, maybe? Suddenly, I heard something, a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. They weren't close, but they were unmistakable. I could feel my heart skip a beat as I strained my ears to hear better. They were coming toward me, slow and deliberate, each step heavier than the last. I held my breath, hoping that maybe I was imagining it. But no. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I tried to make myself smaller, pressing my body into the cold concrete floor as if it could hide me from whoever was coming. My mind raced. What was I supposed to do? I was tied up. I had no weapons. No way out. And then, through the dim light, I saw him. He stepped into the room. The man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a dark jacket, his face partially obscured by the hood pulled over his head. His hands were buried in his pockets, his footsteps echoing off the walls. The way he moved was slow, methodical, as if he were taking his time, enjoying the moment. I didn't know if he had seen me yet, but I wasn't going to wait to find out. I struggled harder against the ropes, feeling the pressure in my arms, the burn in my muscles. The more I struggled, the more I realized how impossible it was. I couldn't escape. He finally spoke, his voice deep, gravelly. You were too curious. I didn't answer. I couldn't find the words. Curious? What the hell did that mean? You should have just kept walking, he continued, stepping closer. But you didn't, did you? You had to stop, had to ask questions. He chuckled darkly. Now look where you are. My stomach twisted and my throat tightened. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't let him see how terrified I was. You think it's just the girl, don't you? He said, almost as if he were talking to himself. She's the bait. People like you never question it when you see a child alone. You never think there's something more going on. But there is. His voice lowered and his eyes flickered to the corner of the room where a large, dark tarp was draped over something. My blood ran cold as he walked over to it and tugged it back. There, underneath, were more ropes. bundles of them, and at least 2 more sets of clothes. I could barely make out the shapes in the low light, but it was enough. Enough to understand that whatever was going on here, it wasn't just about me. It was bigger than that. "We keep them here, he said casually, as if discussing something as mundane as the weather. "The girl's just the beginning. Once you're here, you don't leave. Ever." I felt a knot in my stomach. This was real. This wasn't some twisted nightmare I could wake up from. This was happening. He looked back at me, his eyes narrowing. "Now we just have to wait. You'll learn what happens when people like you wander into the wrong places." The words sank in slowly, a horrible realization gnawing at me. This was a trap. I had walked right into the middle of a network, and I wasn't going to be the last. I wasn't sure how long I stayed there, my mind racing with plans that never seemed feasible. I couldn't even focus on the thought of escape anymore. I just wanted to survive, to somehow make it out of this nightmare alive. Then, just as I began to accept the reality of my situation, I heard something else. Something I hadn't noticed before. The soft, shuffling sound of small feet. It was faint, but it was there. The girl. She was back. I couldn't see her yet, but I could hear her. Her quiet footsteps, the same as before, walking slowly toward me. This time, I didn't feel any sympathy for her. I didn't feel pity or concern. I just felt a deep, visceral sense of dread. She came into the room slowly, her small figure outlined in the doorway. She stopped, her eyes locking onto mine. There was something in her expression, something that wasn't quite human. Her face was still cold, empty. I couldn't help but wonder, was she part of it? Was she in on this? The way she had lured me, the way she had acted. Was she just a child who got caught up in something awful, or was she something darker than I'd imagined? The man didn't say anything when she appeared. He just stood there watching her, like they were part of the same twisted world. The girl didn't speak either. She just stared at me with those wide, unblinking eyes, and for a moment I swore I saw something shift behind them, a glimpse of something cold, calculating. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing as she disappeared into the shadows. I was left alone with the man again. His words stuck with me as the storm outside continued its relentless assault on the world. "Now we wait," he repeated, his tone almost gleeful. "The girl did her part, now it's your turn." A cold, terrible silence filled the room. I had no idea what was going to happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going anywhere. Not without a fight, not unless I found a way out. But in that moment, I couldn't see one. I could only feel the storm closing in around me, the darkness of the garage swallowing me whole. I tried to calm myself, pushing aside the panic that was clawing at my chest. I couldn't just let myself fall apart. I had to think, even if it felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my fear. The room was small, too small for comfort, the concrete walls closing in on me, and the heavy storm outside almost seemed to mimic the chaos inside my head. Every second felt like an eternity, my thoughts tangled with desperation. The man had turned away, going to the corner of the room where the tarp had been. I could hear him shuffling through something, maybe more of those ropes or supplies, I couldn't tell. My mind was racing for any possibility of escape, but nothing made sense. There were no windows wide enough for me to squeeze through, and the door was locked. I had no idea how many others were involved in this, or if there were more people out there waiting for their next bait to wander in. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was a system, a trap that had been carefully set, and I had walked straight into it. I clenched my fists against the ropes, digging my nails into the rough material as if it could somehow tear. The blood was rushing in my ears, the sound of my heartbeat thumping louder than the rain outside. I knew I couldn't waste time. I had to act fast. The man spoke again, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You're not the first to fall for this," he he said, his tone almost amused. "And you won't be the last. People think they're safe, walking the streets at night, thinking it's all fine. But the truth is, it's always dark out there. Out there, and in here too. Always watching." I struggled harder, my legs shaking with the effort. My mind flashed to the girl, the bait, the little girl who had lured me in. Was she as trapped as I was? Was she just a victim too, or was she part of this twisted game, a player who knew how to play her part? The doubt gnawed at me. I needed answers, but I had no time to think about it. The man stopped what he was doing, his footsteps approaching me again, this time slower, more deliberate. I tensed. His shadow loomed over me, and he squatted down to look me in the eyes. For a second, we just stared at each other, and I saw something in his eyes that I couldn't describe, an emptiness, an absence of anything human. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, almost mockingly, "but there's no escape now." His hand reached down to his belt. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what he was about to do. Was he going to kill me? No, I couldn't let that happen. Not yet. I had to fight. I jerked my arms, yanking against the ropes with all my strength, but they were tied too well. The more I struggled, the more helpless I felt. Despair started to creep in, cold and heavy. This was it. The storm outside raged on, a violent crescendo as if the universe itself was amplifying my panic. But then, just as the man reached for something in his pocket, a voice broke through the tension, clear and cutting through the storm outside. The girl. She was standing in the doorway again, her figure small, but this time there was something different in her eyes. She wasn't smiling anymore. The cold emptiness that had marked her face earlier had shifted. She wasn't just a passive player in this nightmare. No, there was something else in her. Something. Darker. The man looked up at her, his expression softening. "You shouldn't be here," he said, almost like he was scolding her. "Get back to your place." But the girl didn't move. She stood there, staring at him with those wide, unblinking eyes, and then she did something I wasn't prepared for. She stepped forward. I saw the way her hands trembled as they reached for something hidden beneath the folds of her soaked dress, something metallic that caught the dim light. A knife. I couldn't believe it. She had a knife. The man's eyes widened in surprise. "What are you doing?" But the girl didn't answer. She didn't need to. In a flash, she lunged forward, stabbing the man with all the fury of a storm. He gasped, stumbling backward, and I could hear the sickening sound of the blade cutting through the air. The rain outside, the thundering storm. It all felt like it was happening in slow motion. The man crumpled to the ground, clutching his side, blood staining his shirt in dark, thick patches. He groaned in pain, unable to stand. The girl stood over him, her knife still clutched tightly in her small, trembling hands. Her face remained expressionless, but her eyes held something that chilled me deeper than anything I had ever felt before. The man was still gasping for breath as he tried to scramble away from her, but she was relentless. He didn't stand a chance. I couldn't understand it. Why was she helping me? Why was she doing this? She had been part of the trap, part of the lure, but now she was ending it. Her expression didn't change as she stood over him, her knife dripping with his blood. I didn't have time to question it. My head was spinning from the shock, the fear, and the desperate need to escape. I yanked at the ropes one more time, this time with more force. I felt the fibers start to loosen, the knots shifting just enough to give me hope. And then the ropes gave way. I pulled my arms free, my hands raw from the friction. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to breathe. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward the door, my legs weak but adrenaline coursing through me. The storm outside had not stopped. It raged like an angry beast, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I didn't look back. I burst through the door into the rain, barely noticing the cold water soaking me through. I didn't stop running. I didn't stop for anything. I just ran, feet pounding the soaked pavement, my heart still hammering in my chest. I couldn't shake the image of the girl standing in that garage, her expression frozen in that dark emptiness. What had I just witnessed? Was she just another victim, or was she part of something bigger? I didn't know, and in that moment, I didn't care. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my apartment, locking the door behind me, gasping for air as if I had just escaped from a nightmare. My hands were shaking, my legs weak from running, and my chest was tight with fear. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The little girl, the man, the garage. It felt like I had been part of some sick, twisted game, but I hadn't won. I couldn't just sit there and pretend like it didn't happen. Someone had to know. Someone had to do something. I grabbed my phone, my fingers barely able to dial the number for the police. I felt like I was losing my mind as I waited for someone to pick up. 911, what's your emergency? A calm, professional voice answered on the other end. I need help, I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. I was kidnapped. I don't know what's going on, but there was a man and a little girl. I was taken to a place, some kind of garage or warehouse. I was tied up, but I escaped. I don't know who they are, but the man's still out there, and the girl. Okay, slow down, the operator interrupted, trying to calm me. Can you give me your address? We'll send someone over right away. I gave her the details, but I could feel the tremor in my voice. I was terrified, and I knew the police might not believe me. What if they thought I was just imagining things? But I had to try. I had to make them understand. I had to make sure they went to that place and found the man. Stay where you are. Stay where you are. Officers will be dispatched to your location, the operator said. Just try to stay calm. Help is on the way. I couldn't sit still. My mind was running in a million directions. I kept thinking about the little girl. What happened to her? Was she okay? Was she still with him? I had seen the man injured. What if he was still out there, waiting to hurt someone else? The rain outside continued to pour, as if the sky itself couldn't escape the darkness. The sound of the storm felt like it was closing in, pressing against my ears, and every creak in the apartment made my heart skip a beat. I couldn't help but feel that something was still out there, something that I hadn't fully escaped from yet. Then, less than an hour later, I heard sirens in the distance. My heart leapt, but a new wave of panic washed over me. What if they were too late? What if they couldn't find the place in time? But just as quickly as the sirens had started, they stopped. I stood at the window, looking out through the rain-soaked glass, my breath fogging up the surface as I watched the blue and red lights flash in the distance. The doorbell rang, and I jumped back, startled. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I rushed to the door and opened it quickly. 2 police officers stood there looking serious. "You called us?" one of them asked. I nodded. "Yes. I told you what happened, about the man and the girl. You have to find them. The man, he's dangerous. He has to be stopped." The officer's eyes narrowed. "We've already sent a unit to the location you described. We'll need you to come with us to give a statement. Can you do that?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes, I'll come. I need to know they're going to be okay. Please, please find them." They led me to the patrol car, and I tried to steady my nerves as we drove toward the industrial area I had described. The rain was coming down harder now, the streets slick with water. My mind raced as I stared out the window. What would I find when we got there? Was the man still alive? What if the girl was still trapped with him? The officers didn't speak much during the drive, but I could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't until we turned down a narrow, dimly lit street that I saw the flashing lights of other police vehicles parked near a dilapidated building. They had found it. The officers stopped the car and got out, signaling me to follow. We moved toward the building where I had been held, and I could hear voices, the buzz of radios, and the scuffling of feet as the scene unfolded around me. One officer stopped me before I could get too close. "We need you to stay back," he said. "We're going in now. You've given us enough information. We'll handle it from here." I nodded, but my heart was in my throat. I watched as a few more officers entered the building, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The rain continued to fall heavily, and for a moment, the storm outside felt like the perfect reflection of everything I had just lived through. Minutes passed like hours. Then a few officers emerged from the building, dragging a man between them. It was him. The same man who had tied me up, the same man who had locked me in that garage. He was stumbling, still alive, but barely. He was handcuffed, his face pale, his shirt soaked in his own blood from the stab wound the girl had given him. I felt a rush of emotions, relief, anger, and disbelief. This man was going to be taken into custody. But what about the girl? I stepped forward, my legs trembling. "Where's the girl?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The little girl, is she here?" One of the officers looked at me, his expression grave. "She's here, but she's in bad shape. We've called an ambulance for her. We'll get her the help she needs." I felt like I could breathe again. Little girl was alive. She was going to be okay. In the days that followed, more details came to light. The man had been part of a small but dangerous group operating out of abandoned warehouses and industrial buildings. They had been using children like that little girl to lure people into their traps, knowing that no one could resist helping a lost child in the rain. Little girl's story wasn't a simple one. She had been taken too, a victim of this group before she was forced into being their bait. The authorities were working with her to understand more about how she got involved. But one thing was clear: she had helped me escape. The man was arrested and charged with multiple counts, and the police continued to investigate the rest of the group. But for me, the worst was over. The terror that had haunted me since that night had finally begun to fade, though the memories would never fully leave me. Little girl was safe now, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a small measure of peace. I'd never forget that stormy night or the strange, terrifying twist of fate that had brought me face to face with the nightmare. But I'd survived. And somehow in that twisted, terrible moment, I had been given a chance to help save a little girl. The nightmare was over, at least for now. I never thought I'd be telling a story like this. I'm still shaking as I type this out, but I have to share it. Maybe it'll help someone else or just make sense of what happened that night. You know, something real and tangible that might prevent this kind of thing from happening again. So a little about me. I'm just your average person, nothing special. I'm in my mid-30s, live alone in a small house on the edge of a quiet town in California. It's a rental place, just a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom cottage, nothing too fancy, but it's mine. I've lived here for a couple of years now. The house is in a rural part of town, a bit isolated from the rest of civilization. The nearest neighbor is about a quarter-mile away, and the land around here is mostly woods and scrub. If you go a little farther out, there are some hills, but it's all pretty empty. There's a lot of space around me, a lot of nature. It's peaceful, or it used to be. I'm also not someone who scares easily. I don't get worked up over random sounds at night or eerie creaks in the house. I'm not one to jump at shadows or get paranoid, but that night it was different, and it still haunts me to this day. Now I live with my dog Max. He's a big, strong German Shepherd, about 5 years old. He's always been protective but calm, especially around strangers. He's the kind of dog who knows his boundaries. But I could tell something was wrong that night. Max was acting strange, even for him. It started around 9 p.m. I was sitting on the couch in the living room watching TV, trying to relax after a long day. The rain had been coming down for hours by that point, heavy, almost relentless. The wind picked up too, making the branches of the old oak trees in the yard sway and groan. I could hear it hitting the windows like a constant, rhythmic tap, tap, tapping. and every now and then there was a sharp crack of thunder that seemed to shake the walls of the house. The power flickered once, but came back on almost immediately. It was the kind of storm that had you feeling like the world was on the brink of something big. Max was lying next to me, curled up on the floor beside the couch, his head resting on the edge. He looked content, like he didn't mind the storm. But I noticed he was acting a bit off. His ears were perked up, his head slightly turned toward the back door. He wasn't the type to just bark at anything, especially not during a storm when everything outside was loud and chaotic. I thought maybe he was just reacting to the thunder or a sound I hadn't noticed, but the way he was looking at that door, it felt different, like he was waiting for something. And then it happened. The first bark was sudden, loud, and sharp. Max shot to his feet in an instant, his body rigid, his tail held high. He barked again, more aggressively this time, as though he'd seen something or someone that shouldn't be there. I jumped, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't a playful bark or a reaction to the storm. This was different. This was the kind of bark that meant danger. I glanced at the clock on the wall, 9:15 p.m. I stood up and walked toward the back door, my thoughts racing. Maybe there was an animal outside. Raccoons, deer, coyotes, they're common around here. But Max's reaction felt far too intense for just a critter. I pulled the blinds open and peered through the window at the dark, rain-soaked backyard. The motion sensor lights were on, casting an eerie, dim glow across the yard. But I didn't see anything. I stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what Max was reacting to. The house felt unusually quiet. Just the sound of the rain beating against the windows and Max's steady growl in the background. The atmosphere was thick, like the air had become denser somehow. Everything felt heavier. I watched as Max paced back and forth between the door and the window, stopping every few seconds to bark at the backyard. It was unnerving. His growls had deepened into something more like a low, guttural warning. I felt my pulse quicken. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen. I don't know why, but I had this overwhelming feeling that I needed to check outside, even though every instinct told me to stay inside and call the police. Still, I wasn't entirely sure if I was just being paranoid or if there was something real out there. The last thing I wanted to do was make a scene or freak myself out over nothing. But Max's behavior, his eyes, his posture, told me that whatever was happening outside was serious. I stepped into the hallway, the flashlight trembling in my grip as I moved toward the door. The house was eerily quiet now, the storm outside somehow more deafening in its silence. There was something about it all, an unnatural stillness that made my stomach turn. It was like the world was holding its breath. I opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking in the dead quiet. The rain was pouring down even harder now, and the wind howled through the trees. The backyard was dark, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the ground. My flashlight cut through the darkness, flicking across the yard. For a split second, everything seemed normal. But then, I saw it. At the far end of the yard, near the shed, there was a shape. A figure. It was barely noticeable at first, blending into the dark shadows under the trees. I thought it might have been one of the larger bushes or a shadow cast by the storm, but as my flashlight beam shifted, I saw it move. I froze. A person. It was a man, crouched down, barely visible in the shadow of the shed. My heart skipped a beat. It didn't make sense. Why was someone out there in the middle of a storm, hidden in my yard? I knew then that something was very wrong. Max was still growling behind me, his deep voice vibrating through the house. But now I could hear him barking, much louder, almost frantic. The man in the yard hadn't noticed yet. I felt like I should go back inside, lock the door, call the police. But the decision was out of my hands. Before I could even think about stepping back into the house, I heard a rustling in the dark. The man shifted and my breath caught in my throat. He had stood up now, still partially hidden by the darkness, but I could see his outline more clearly. He was wearing a dark jacket, his face hidden by the hood. He hadn't noticed me, but I could tell he was moving closer to the back of the house. That's when I realized he was trying to get inside. Panic set in. I should have turned around, gone back inside, and locked the door behind me. I should have called 911 then and there. But instead, I found myself walking toward the yard, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't even know why. Maybe it was my mind telling me I needed to confront whatever this was, or maybe I was just frozen by fear. But I kept walking, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the rain and darkness. I stopped about 10 feet from the man, shining the light directly on him. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound confident. "What are you doing here? Leave now!" The man didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge me at first. His stillness made my blood run cold. I could feel the terror starting to rise in my chest, and then, as if on cue, he slowly turned toward me. That's when I saw it. In his hand, a knife. The metal gleamed faintly in the light, and my stomach dropped. He wasn't holding it casually. He was ready to use it. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I could barely think straight. He stepped forward. My legs felt weak. I stumbled backward, trying to make sense of what was happening, but I didn't have time to react. My foot caught on something, a rock, maybe, or the uneven ground from the rain, and I fell hard onto the wet grass. My flashlight flew from my hand, spinning across the yard and landing somewhere in the mud. My pulse hammered in my chest, and for a second, I couldn't even move. I was terrified. And then, as if from nowhere, I heard it. A loud bark. Sharp, aggressive, and full of rage. Max, he was charging out of the house, racing toward the man with his teeth bared. I don't know how I saw it, but in that split second, the man hesitated. His hand with the knife froze. Max was coming fast, his growl echoing through the yard, and the man seemed to realize he was about to be attacked. I don't know if he was afraid of the dog or if he thought I'd have a chance to escape, but he turned and bolted, running into the rain-soaked night. Max chased him for a few seconds, barking fiercely until the man disappeared into the shadows, lost in the storm. Max didn't stop, though. He kept barking, circling the yard, his body tense, his growls low and warning. I slowly got to my feet, heart still pounding, and rushed back into the house, locking the door behind me. Max came in a few moments later, still alert, his fur soaked from the rain. He stood there looking at me, tail wagging, almost like he was expecting praise. I fell to my knees in relief, pulling him close. My dog had saved my life. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I know one thing. If it hadn't been for Max, I wouldn't be here today. The authorities never found anyone matching the description I gave. They searched the area, but the man seemed to have vanished without a trace. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe in that house again. The storm came and went, but that night, that feeling of being watched, of being hunted, lingered. But I do know one thing for sure. Max is my hero, and I'll never take him for granted again. I had never been the type to get scared of the wilderness. I'd been hiking in the California woods on my own for years, always looking for that sense of solitude, that brief escape from the noise of everyday life, the kind of peace that only comes from the isolation of a trail surrounded by trees, rocks, and the sound of the wind moving through the leaves. And it always worked for me, until that day. It was early October, and I decided to take a solo trip. I'd been planning it for weeks, a 2-night hike in the Mendocino National Forest, just a quick getaway to clear my head. The forecast showed light rain, but nothing I couldn't handle. I'd done this a dozen times before, and the trails were familiar. I wasn't concerned, but I should have been. The first few hours went by without a hitch. The trail was muddy, but I didn't mind. I loved the smell of wet earth and the sound of the squelching mud under my boots. The trees were thick, their branches like dark, twisted hands reaching up toward the sky. The air was damp, cool, but not cold. Everything felt right, peaceful. But then, around noon, the skies began to shift. I had just reached the edge of a small clearing when the first raindrop hit my face. I looked up, seeing the gray clouds roll in, thick and low. The wind began to stir the branches in a way that felt off. It wasn't just a breeze. It was like the trees were groaning in response to something unnatural, something coming. I pulled my hood up and tightened the straps on my backpack. I knew I should have turned back then, but the storm still felt distant. I thought maybe I could outrun it, but by the time I'd made it another mile, the rain had intensified and the sky had darkened in a way that felt unnatural. That's when it happened. The first lightning strike was deafening. It cracked the sky open with such force that I stumbled and nearly fell. I hadn't realized how close the storm had gotten until I saw the flash of light. Thunder followed a second later, rattling my bones. I squinted into the heavy rain, trying to find some shelter, but there was nothing. Just trees, a few rocks, and the relentless storm. The path ahead was unclear, and I felt a rising panic as the rain came down harder, the wind picking up and the cold settling in. I had been hiking for hours with no shelter in sight. The trail, I now realized, wasn't just muddy, it was turning into a river. The dirt was softening under my feet and I was slipping more than walking. Panic gripped me again. I couldn't be out here in this, not without a way to stay warm, not without some kind of cover. I needed help. I needed to find somewhere to wait out the storm. That's when I saw it. Through the thick mist, barely visible, was a small structure, just the outline of a roof peeking out from behind the trees. At first I thought it might have been my mind playing tricks on me, but no. It was real. A cabin. I couldn't believe it. There shouldn't have been any cabins here. I knew these woods, and this part of the trail was remote. Nobody lived out here, or at least I didn't think they did. But in that moment, it didn't matter. I was cold, wet, and desperate. I made my way through the downpour, slipping and stumbling over the slick rocks and muddy ground until I reached the cabin. I could barely see it through the rain, but it looked small, just a simple wooden structure with a porch. Its weathered walls blended in with the trees, and the door was barely visible through the sheets of rain. I knocked, hard, my fist pounding on the wood. The sound was muffled by the storm, but I was sure I heard footsteps inside. I waited, heart pounding, my breath heavy. Maybe it was just a vacation cabin, or maybe someone was there. I didn't care, I just needed shelter. The door creaked open, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Standing in the doorway was a man. He was tall, much taller than me, and hunched slightly, like he had spent years bent over doing some hard labor. His skin was weathered, like it had been burned by the sun for decades, and his eyes were narrow, piercing, hard to read. His face was lined, deeply so, with years of living off the grid, away from the world. His clothes were old, ragged, brown and gray, a mix of dirt and sweat staining them. His beard was scraggly, barely kept, and his hair was long, tangled. He looked like someone who hadn't seen another person in years. "Get inside," he rasped. His voice was deep and gravelly, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days, maybe weeks. I didn't think, just acted. I stepped inside, grateful for the warmth that hit me as soon as I crossed the threshold. It wasn't much, just a small cabin, dimly lit by a single lantern on a table. The room smelled of smoke, wood, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. It was damp too, but warmer than the outside. He shut the door behind me. The sound of the lock turning was so quiet, but in the silence of that cabin, it felt deafening. I turned to face him, unsure what to say. "Storm's bad," I said, my voice shaking. I didn't expect it to hit so hard. I thought I'd be able to outrun it. I'm sorry if I've inconvenienced you." The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at me, his gaze cold, almost too calculating. It made my stomach twist. "You lost?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he scanned me from head to toe. I didn't know how to answer. "I guess you could say that," I mumbled, rubbing my arms against the cold. "I wasn't expecting to find shelter, but thank you for letting me in." The man nodded, but didn't speak again. He gestured to a small chair by the stove. I sat, trying to avoid his gaze. The fire in the stove crackled, and the warmth began to seep into my clothes. But the sense of unease didn't leave. It settled in my chest, heavy and unshakable. Something about the way the man was looking at me, like he knew something I didn't, like he was studying me, weighing my every move. I tried to shake it off, but then I heard it. The lock. The sound was so faint I almost didn't recognize it. But it was there, a small click, like the door being locked again. I turned to look at the man, but he wasn't looking at me anymore. His back was to me now as he walked over to a shelf lined with jars. The quiet was suffocating. I had this weird sense that I wasn't supposed to be here, that I wasn't meant to have found this place. "Where do you live?" I asked, trying to break the silence, to ignore the dread that was creeping up my spine. His response was slow, deliberate. "Here," he said, his voice like sandpaper. "Been here for a long time." The words felt like they carried more weight than they should have. I glanced around the cabin again. There were no signs of recent life, no personal touches, no photographs, no books, nothing that spoke of a person who might be living here by choice. Just jars, canned food, a few basic tools, and that stove. The place had the feeling of someone who lived off the land, but it didn't feel like home. Something about the emptiness unsettled me. I could feel my muscles tensing as I thought about what this man might be doing out here. "People get lost out here," he muttered as if reading my mind. His voice was low, like he was speaking to himself. They wander off the trail, think they're safe, but they're not." I didn't know what to say to that. He turned to face me, and his eyes held something darker in them now. Something dangerous. "You think I just live here for peace?" he asked, a strange smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "People think they can wander through these woods, come in here, and leave whenever they want." I froze. Something shifted in the air. The atmosphere turned colder, the weight of the cabin pressing down on me. "You won't be leaving," he added. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I turned toward the door. I tried to open it. No movement. The man's eyes never left me. "Sit down," he said, his voice softer now, but far more chilling. "You're not going anywhere." I could feel the blood drain from my face. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a random encounter, and I was in deeper trouble than I'd ever imagined. I tried the door again, my fingers trembling on the cold brass handle, but it didn't budge. Panic set in. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears it drowned out the rain outside. I could feel my breaths growing shallow as I turned back to the man, who was now standing motionless by the table, just watching me. His face was impassive, but there was something in his eyes, something dark that sent a chill straight through me. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. His lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't kind. It wasn't even amused. It was predatory. "I want you to understand why you're here," he said softly, his voice almost soothing. "You think this is an accident. You think you just stumbled into some random cabin and I'm just some hermit. But you're wrong. It's not an accident. I've been watching you ever since you stepped onto these trails." I froze. I'm sorry, I don't understand," I stammered, my words tumbling out too quickly. "You will," he replied, his voice eerily calm. "I've been living off the grid for years, watching people like you, waiting for them to wander in. And you were just unlucky enough to cross my path." His words hit me like a slap. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just some isolated, unlucky coincidence. He knew I was out here. He had been waiting for someone like me. "I didn't mean to intrude. I just got lost in the storm. Please, I'll leave, I swear. Just open the door." He shook his head, almost sadly. "You don't understand. You can't leave." I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you mean?" What are you going to do? For a moment, I thought I saw something flash in his eyes, a flicker of something sharp, something dangerous. He stepped closer, his pace slow and deliberate, like he wasn't in any rush, like he was enjoying my fear. My mind was racing, trying to figure out any way to escape, but my body was frozen with terror. The reality of what he was saying was settling in like lead in my stomach. I stumbled back a few more steps, but the cabin's small, confined space closed in around me. There were no way to escape. The man had already locked the door, and I had no idea if anyone would come for me. Please, please let me go, I pleaded, my voice cracking with fear. He didn't respond right away. He just stood there, silent, watching me like a predator watches its prey. The quiet of the cabin was almost unbearable. The rain had stopped outside, but the storm inside the cabin was palpable. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I searched for a way out. The man was getting closer, and I couldn't think. My mind was clouded with panic. I felt the wall behind me and pressed my back into it, as if it could offer any kind of protection. But I knew better. There was no protection here. The man was too calm, too prepared. He knew exactly what he was doing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dull knife. It was a simple blade, nothing fancy, but it gleamed ominously in the dim light of the cabin. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice dripping with menace, "but you can't leave." I felt a scream building in my chest, but it wouldn't come out. My throat felt tight, choked by fear. My mind raced for an escape, but there was no way out. The cabin was too small, the door locked, and the man was too close. "You're not going anywhere," he said, the words so calm, so sure, that I felt a sense of hopelessness settle over me. I turned, desperate, and looked around the cabin again. There had to be something. Anything. But it was all the same, nothing but cold walls and the looming presence of the man behind me. Suddenly, he lunged. I don't know how I managed to dodge him, but I did. I shoved past him, tripping over my own feet, crashing into the table. It tipped over, scattering jars across the floor with a loud clatter. For a moment, I thought I had a chance. I scrambled to my feet, my legs still shaking with fear. But he was already moving toward me again, faster this time. His face was full of rage now, his eyes wild. "Stay down," he shouted, his voice booming. I didn't listen. I didn't have time to listen. I grabbed the chair by the stove and swung it at him, desperate to keep him away. The chair connected with his shoulder, knocking him back a step, but he didn't fall. Instead, he grinned, his expression now one of twisted amusement. "Fighting back won't help you," he said, voice still cold like he'd seen this all before. In that moment, I realized there was no escape. No one would come. No one knew where I was, and no one would find me here. The storm outside had passed. The world beyond the cabin was calm again, but inside, there was nothing but fear and the certainty that I wasn't leaving. I felt my heart in my throat, my blood running cold. There was no more thinking, just pure animal instinct. I turned, the world around me a blur, and ran for the back wall of the cabin. My hands fumbled around trying to find something, anything that I could use. My breath was ragged, every intake of air a desperate gasp. The man was moving slowly, methodically, but each step felt like a countdown. "You're not going anywhere," he repeated, almost too calm. I could feel the weight of his presence behind me, his eyes never leaving me. I slammed my fist into the wall in frustration, trying to find a way out, but there was nothing. It was all wood, thin and creaky, and the walls felt like they were closing in on me. Suddenly, I noticed a small window, just barely visible from the side of the room. It was covered in grime and looked like it hadn't been opened in years. My hope flickered for a split second. Maybe I could get through there. I ran toward it, desperate. My fingers grazed the edge of the frame, but as I yanked on the window, it didn't budge. It was sealed shut, sealed by time and neglect. I let out a frustrated scream. "Stop running!" The man's voice was close now. His shadow loomed over me, and I froze. The knife glinted in his hand, a terrible promise in its sharp edges. The air in the room felt thick, heavy. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. My legs felt like they were moving through mud. I had nowhere left to run. "Please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Just let me go, please." The man was right behind me now, so close I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. I turned quickly, my hands raised in a desperate attempt to protect myself. But it was too late. The man grabbed me by the arm, his grip like iron. His fingers dug into my skin, making me wince in pain. "You should have never come here," he hissed in my ear. His breath rancid, like old meat. With a sudden, brutal movement, he shoved me backward. I crashed into the table, sending it skidding across the floor with a loud crash. My head slammed against the edge of it, and for a moment, everything went black. I was disoriented, dizzy, but I forced myself to focus, to push through the pain. When my vision cleared, I saw the man standing above me, his knife raised. There was no fear in his eyes, just that same cold smile. I had to do something, anything. But my body was numb, my limbs heavy, like they weren't mine. My breathing was ragged, every breath a struggle. I wasn't going to make it out of here. I tried to crawl away, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. My body felt like it was being crushed under the weight of his presence. Then, just as he began to step forward, a loud, violent banging came from the door. It rattled the whole cabin, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining it, but the force of the blows didn't stop. The man turned toward the door, his eyes flicking with a mixture of annoyance and fear. "Who is it?" he hissed under his breath, his grip on the knife tightening. The pounding grew louder, more insistent. The man froze, glancing back at me with a flash of something dangerous in his eyes. "Stay down," he growled. But before he could take another step, the door splintered. With a loud crack, the door flew open, and in the doorway stood a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in rugged outdoor gear. The figure's face was obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the look of sheer authority in their stance. "Get away from her," the figure growled, his voice deep and commanding. The man, his knife still gripped tightly in his hand, snarled, but before he could move, the figure lunged forward with terrifying speed. There was a struggle, the sound of fists connecting with flesh, and then silence. The man crumpled to the floor, unconscious or worse, I didn't know. But the figure didn't stop there. They turned to me, kneeling beside me, their hands gentle as they helped me sit up. "Are you okay?" The figure's voice was soft, but the concern in their words was clear. I nodded, my body trembling with shock, my heart still racing. I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Who was this person? How had they found me? Who are you?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. The figure reached down and pulled off their hood, revealing a face that was familiar. It took me a moment, but when it clicked, my blood ran cold. It was a park ranger, one I had passed earlier in the day while hiking a few miles from the trailhead. He had been keeping watch, it seemed. Watching him. "Never should have been out here alone," the ranger muttered under his breath, his hands quickly checking me for any major injuries. "He's been doing this for years. Waiting for people like you." I couldn't speak. My mind couldn't wrap around the reality of it. He's been living out here, attacking hikers who stray off the path. He's set traps, places like this cabin where he waits, where he lures in anyone who's lost. The ranger's voice was grim. "You're lucky I was patrolling the area today." I looked over at the man, his body limp on the floor. He wasn't moving. He wasn't going to hurt anyone ever again. The ranger helped me to my feet, his grip strong and reassuring. "You're safe now," he said, his voice steady, but there was a clear edge of exhaustion in his words. The rain had stopped outside, and as I looked out the small cabin window, I could see the sky clearing. The storm had passed, but my world would never be the same. The ranger led me out of the cabin, and as I stepped into the clearing, I felt the weight of what had just happened crash down on me. I would never forget the cold, calculating stare of that man, the twisted look in his eyes as he waited for his next victim. And I would never forget how close I came to being another lost soul in those woods. But I was lucky. I was one of the fortunate ones. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the Vault awaits your return.